May 24, 1941, dusk, east of Syracuse, Sicily. HMS Upholder, a 630-ton submarine under Lieutenant Commander Malcolm David Wanklyn, stalked a heavily escorted Italian troop convoy. Wanklyn's target was the SS Conte Rosso, a 17,879-ton converted ocean liner carrying 2,729 soldiers bound for Rommel's Afrika Corps. 5 Italian destroyers screened the convoy. Upholder was fighting half-blind. Her ASDIC, the sonar and listening gear essential for detecting threats, was completely non-functional. As Wanklyn lined up his attack at close range, a destroyer materialized out of the darkening sea at high speed, bearing directly down on the submarine. He narrowly avoided being rammed. Once clear, he swung his periscope sights onto the massive troopship and fired 2 torpedoes. Both struck home. Conte Rosso sank rapidly, killing 1,297 of the troops and crew aboard. Wanklyn took Upholder down to 46 meters, as the escorts dropped 37 depth charges in 20 minutes directly above him. Without ASDIC, he navigated blind through the barrage, relying on instinct and seamanship to bring his crew home to Malta. The Victoria Cross citation, gazetted December 16, 1941, praised Wanklyn's great valour and resolution. It was the first VC awarded to a submariner in the Second World War. When a steward secretly sewed the purple VC ribbon onto Wanklyn's monkey jacket while he slept at the Lazaretto base, Wanklyn was reportedly disgusted at what he took for a bad joke, unable to believe he had won the highest decoration. The submarine that achieved this was never designed to fight. The U-class had been conceived in 1934 as an unarmed practice target for surface ships to train against. Critics dismissed them as too small, too slow, too cramped for operational service. Upholder displaced less than half of a standard fleet submarine, carried half the torpedoes, and was 6 knots slower on the surface than any comparable boat. Yet submarines like Upholder would sink over 400,000 tons of Axis shipping in 18 months, destroy up to 77% of Rommel's supplies in peak months, and directly shape the outcome of the North African War. How did boats designed as training targets become the most lethal submarine force in the Mediterranean? The answer begins with geography. Malta sits 60 miles south of Sicily and 190 nautical miles from Tripoli, directly astride the Axis supply route connecting Italian ports to North Africa. The Strait of Sicily, barely 90 miles wide between Sicily and Tunisia, funneled virtually all Axis convoy traffic through a choke point within hours of Malta. The alternatives were fatally compromised by distance. Alexandria, home of the first submarine flotilla, lay 715 nautical miles from the critical shipping lanes. Submarines spent days in transit, drastically reducing patrol time on station. Gibraltar, base of the 8th Flotilla, was even further at 860 nautical miles. A submarine departing Malta could be hunting convoys within hours. The pre-war Admiralty had recognised Malta's potential. Bomb-proof submarine pens had been planned but were cancelled before the war on cost grounds, a decision that would exact a terrible price. The Mediterranean Fleet headquarters had been moved from Valletta to Alexandria in 1937 due to Malta's perceived vulnerability to air attack, despite Churchill's objections. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Flag Officer Submarines, appointed Commander George Walter Gillow Simpson to establish the submarine force at Malta in January 1941. Simpson's orders included the instruction to treat his commanding officers like Derby winners. Known as Shrimp for his short, stocky build, Simpson had commanded the mine-laying submarine HMS Porpoise before the war, where Wanklyn served as his first lieutenant. That professional trust would underpin the flotilla's success. Simpson gave commanders freedom to decline missions. When Tompkinson once said he did not care for sudden schemes and asked to be counted out, Simpson simply replied that urge would not go. His shore base, HMS Talbot, occupied the ancient Lazaretto, a former plague quarantine hospital, on Manuel Island in Marsumpset Harbour. The flotilla was formally designated the 10th Submarine Flotilla on September 1, 1941, though submarines had been operating under Simpson's command since January. The timing was critical. Rommel had arrived in North Africa in February 1941 with the Deutsches Afrika Corps, immediately going on the offensive. By March and April 1941, he had pushed British forces back to the Egyptian frontier. His advance depended entirely on supplies crossing the Mediterranean. Malta's submarines were positioned to cut that lifeline. The U-class submarines that formed the backbone of the 10th Flotilla had an unlikely origin. In March 1934, Rear Admiral Submarines Noel Lawrence approved a specification for what the Admiralty called a small, simple submarine for anti-submarine training. The first three boats, HMS Undine, Unity, and Ursula, were ordered from Vickers Armstrongs at Barrow-in-Furness on November 5, 1936. Torpedo tubes were added during construction only as war loomed. The resulting submarine was strikingly small by contemporary standards. The U-class displaced 540 to 658 tons surfaced, compared to 1,290 tons for the T-class and 769 tons for a German Type 7C. Length was 191 to 196 feet, against 276 feet for the T-class. The U-class carried just 4 bow torpedo tubes with 8 torpedoes total. The T-class carried 10 tubes with 17 torpedoes. Surface speed was 11¼ knots, 6 knots slower than any comparable submarine. Crew complement was 27 to 33 men crammed into a hull designed for 27. The operational diving depth of just 200 feet gave minimal margin against depth charges. Singing propellers were a constant acoustic liability, and the sudden loss of torpedo weight when firing a salvo caused the boat to porpoise and break the surface, potentially revealing its position at the worst possible moment. 2 wash basins serving salt water only, 2 toilets with an infamously complicated 12-step operating procedure that risked flooding the boat, and a pressure hull designed for 27 men now crammed with 33. By every conventional measure, the U-class was inadequate. Yet the trait that made them seem inadequate was precisely what saved them. Larger submarines proved catastrophically vulnerable in the Mediterranean's clear, shallow waters. The OP and R-class boats displacing 1,400 tons and deployed in 1940 suffered roughly 50% losses. Their hulls were visible from the air at depth. T-class boats, while more capable, presented significantly larger targets. The U-class, with its tiny profile and nimble handling, was far harder to spot. The boats originally dismissed as too small for operational use turned out to be optimally sized for the one theatre where every other submarine was too large. A total of 49 U-class submarines were completed during the war across 3 production groups, with later variants featuring increased fuel capacity of 55 tons versus 38, extending range to approximately 5,500 nautical miles. The combat record speaks in tonnage sunk and supplies denied. Between January 1941 and December 1942, the 10th Submarine Flotilla sank 412,575 tons of Axis shipping, while never fielding more than 12 submarines simultaneously. Over the full campaign from 1940 to 1944, Malta-based submarines accounted for over 1 million tons destroyed. The base supplied 1,790 torpedoes. The flotilla fired 1,289, achieving a remarkable 30% hit rate, more than 4 times the Italian submarine fleet's 7.22%. The supply interdiction statistics tell the strategic story with devastating clarity. In September 1941, 33% of 96,000 tons dispatched to North Africa were lost. In November 1941, Malta-based forces destroyed 63% of all Axis cargoes bound for North Africa. 77% of fuel destined for Panzer Group Africa was sunk. Rommel entered Operation Crusader with 15% of the supplies he needed. In October through December 1941, less than a third of supplies shipped from Italian ports reached Libya. The contrast emerged starkly in April 1942, when the Luftwaffe suppressed Malta. Only 189 tons out of 150,578 were lost, a 99.9% delivery rate, proving how vital Malta's offensive capacity was. Once Malta recovered, the stranglehold resumed. From November 1942 to May 1943, 477 vessels totaling over 700,000 tons were sent to the bottom in 5 months. HMS Upholder compiled the most extraordinary individual record. Under Wanklyn, she sank approximately 93,000 tons of verified shipping across 24 patrols, including the liner Conte Rosso, troopships Neptunia and Oceania, destroyer Libeccio, and 2 Italian submarines. 4 months after the Conte Rosso attack, on September 18, 1941, Wanklyn surpassed even that achievement. Acting on ultra-intelligence, Commander Simpson scrambled 4 submarines with 90 minutes' notice to intercept 3 Italian troopships: Neptunia at 19,475 tons, Oceania at 19,507 tons, and Vulcania, carrying over 5,000 German and Italian troops from Taranto to Tripoli. At 0406 hours, Wanklyn fired 4 torpedoes from 5,000 yards. 3 struck, 2 hit Neptunia, 1 struck Oceania in her propellers, stopping her dead. Forced deep by an escort, Upholder actually passed beneath the crippled Oceania, surfaced on the far side and fired 2 more torpedoes. Oceania sank in 8 minutes. Combined result, nearly 40,000 tons destroyed in a single engagement. Wanklyn told everyone it was sheer luck, that he had used no proper calculations, no readings, nothing but the naked eye peering through the periscope. HMS Urge under Lieutenant Commander Tompkinson torpedoed the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto, displacing 41,000 tons on December 14, 1941, the largest enemy capital ship torpedoed at sea by a Royal Navy submarine in the entire war. She later sank the cruiser Giovanni delle Bandinere on April 1, 1942. HMS Turbulent under Commander Tubby Linton, a T-class boat, accounted for approximately 100,000 tons, including 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer, 1 U-boat, and 28 supply ships, plus 3 trains destroyed by gunfire in shore bombardments. Linton spent 254 days at sea in his final year, surviving over 250 depth charge attacks. The Polish submarines ORP Sokół and ORP Dzik, the terrible twins, collectively accounted for approximately 37 enemy vessels sunk or damaged. Sokól's penetration of Navarino harbour on November 19, 1941 was extraordinary. She damaged the destroyer Avier and sank a 5,600-ton steamer while escaping through anti-submarine nets. If you're enjoying this, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. The enemy's own words provide the most powerful testimony to what these submarines achieved. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff at the Deutsches Afrika Korps, stated after the war, "We should have taken Alexandria and reached the Suez Canal had it not been for the work of your submarines." Rommel himself wrote in May 1941, "Without Malta, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa." The German naval liaison in Rome described submarine and air sinkings between July and September 1941 as catastrophic. A week after Rommel noted on October 29, 1942, that fuel and munitions were very scarce and that he was decidedly pessimistic, the German General Staff acknowledged the crisis formally. They stated that the enemy had recognized sea supply communications as the weak point in North Africa operations, that defense against submarines was barely sufficient, and against air attack was inadequate. Vice Admiral Weichold, the German naval liaison at Italian headquarters, stated bluntly that the most dangerous British weapon was the submarine, especially those based on Malta. By February 1943, Weichold reported there were days in which, throughout the whole of Sicily, there was not even a ton of fuel to be found. Field Marshal Kesselring appointed Commander-in-Chief South in December 1941 specifically to neutralise Malta, threw the full weight of Fliegerkorps II against the island. He ultimately reported to the German High Command that there was nothing left to bomb. Yet the moment the Luftwaffe shifted resources, Malta's submarines resumed their stranglehold. Kesselring repeatedly urged both Goering and Hitler to invade Malta, recognising that air bombardment alone could not permanently eliminate the submarine threat. The contrast with Italian submarine performance demonstrates that size and numbers meant nothing without doctrine and determination. Italy entered the war with 115 submarines, one of the world's largest fleets. Yet Italian boats sank only 21 merchantmen and 13 warships in the Mediterranean, approximately 100,000 tons, firing 471 torpedoes at a hit rate of just 7.22%. The 10th Flotilla, with its handful of tiny boats, outperformed the entire Italian submarine fleet fourfold. Italian submarines suffered from outdated doctrine. They fired single torpedoes while British boats fired salvos. They had large conning towers visible from the air, slow diving times, and a conservative operational culture driven by devastating early losses. 10 Italian submarines were lost in the first 20 days of the war. The U-class displaced less than half of a typical Italian boat, 540 tons against 1,000 to 1,050 tons. The Italians carried more torpedoes, 16 versus 8. They were faster on the surface, 17 knots against 11 1/4. By every specification, they should have dominated. The Mediterranean was their home waters, yet the British boats achieved a 30% hit rate against the Italian 7%. They sank 4 times the tonnage with a fraction of the numbers. Doctrine, training, and aggressive leadership mattered more than displacement. German U-boats, deployed to the Mediterranean from September 1941 onwards, proved more dangerous, sinking the carriers Ark Royal and Eagle, battleship Barham, and 95 merchant ships totalling 449,206 tons. But their mission was fundamentally different, targeting Royal Navy warships rather than interdicting supply lines. Approximately 60 U-boats entered the Mediterranean. 62 were destroyed there. The passage through Gibraltar was one way. None returned. The human cost was severe, and the submarine sacrifice paid for every ton of cargo denied to Rommel. During the war, 19 U-class submarines were lost, with 13 falling in the Mediterranean. Across all Mediterranean submarine operations, the Royal Navy lost 50 submarines. By the end of March 1942, Axis air attacks and enemy action had claimed 19 submarines operating from Malta alone. HMS Upholder, the flotilla's most celebrated boat, was lost on April 14, 1942, with all 31 hands, including Wanklyn. She was almost certainly depth-charged by the Italian torpedo boat Pegaso northeast of Tripoli. She had been on her 25th patrol, intended to be her last before returning to England for refit. The Admiralty's tribute was unprecedented. The ship and her company are gone, but the example and inspiration remain. HMS Urge struck a German mine just 2 kilometres outside Gran Harbour on April 27, 1942, while evacuating to Alexandria. All 44 aboard perished, including Tompkinson and a war correspondent. Her wreck was discovered in 2019 by a University of Malta team at 110 to 130 metres depth, with the letters URG still visible on the conning tower. HMS Turbulent was lost around March 12, 1943, with all 63 crew, probably mined off Sardinia. HMS Pandora was destroyed by Luftwaffe bombing in Malta harbour on April 1, 1942. Churchill stated there was no branch of His Majesty's forces which in the war had suffered the same proportion of total loss as the submarine service. The statistics confirmed it. Approximately 3,160 to 3,400 British submariners were killed during the war. At the outset, submarine crews numbered about 5,150, less than 4% of the Royal Navy, giving a fatality rate of approximately 30 to 40%, the highest of any Royal Navy branch. The submariners endured Malta's siege alongside its civilian population. The island suffered 3,343 air raids totaling 2,357 hours under attack. In April 1942 alone, 282 raids dropped 6,727 tons of bombs, more than London received during the entire Blitz. Submarines in harbour had to dive and sit on the harbour bed during daylight to avoid destruction. King George VI awarded Malta the George Cross on April 15, 1942, the only time a nation received the decoration. The correlation between Malta's operational status and Rommel's fortunes was the campaign's defining pattern. When the Luftwaffe suppressed Malta in early 1942, Axis supply losses fell to as low as 3 to 6%, and Rommel advanced to within 60 miles of Alexandria. When Malta's forces were active, losses soared past 60%, and Rommel's offensives ground to a halt for lack of fuel and ammunition. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought from October 23 to November 4, 1942, provides the sharpest illustration. In the critical weeks before the battle, Malta-based submarines and aircraft systematically destroyed Rommel's fuel supply. The tanker Proserpina, carrying 4,500 tons of fuel and cargo ship Tergestia, carrying 1,000 tons of fuel and 1,000 tons of ammunition, were sunk on October 26. Tanker Louisiano with 2,500 tons of fuel followed on October 28. On November 1, tankers Tripolino and Ostia were torpedoed. No fuel reached Libya in the first week of October. By the battle's climax, Rommel had 90 tanks facing Montgomery's 800, and told his commanders it would be quite impossible to disengage from the enemy because there was no petrol for such a manoeuvre. They had only one choice, and that was to fight to the end at Alamein. The 3-week period preceding El Alamein saw submarines sink more tonnage than air attacks. Together they destroyed 44% of all cargoes sailed to Libya. Across the broader Mediterranean campaign, submarines accounted for 53% of the 2 million tons of Axis shipping sunk, aircraft for 40%, and surface forces for 7%. Think back to that moment in May 1941. Dusk off Sicily, a 630-ton submarine designed as a training target, with broken sonar, her captain navigating blind through a depth-charge barrage after sinking a 17,000-ton troopship with over 2,000 soldiers aboard. The Admiralty staff who specified unarmed practice targets in 1934 were wrong. The critics who said U-class boats were too small for operational service were wrong. The Italian supermariner who believed their 115 submarines would dominate their home waters were wrong. And Rommel, who needed those supplies to reach Alexandria, learned exactly how wrong they all were. 412,575 tons sunk in 18 months. A 30% torpedo hit rate against the Italian 7%. 77% of fuel supplies destroyed in November 1941. Never more than 12 submarines at once. Crews numbering barely 400 men. The 10th Submarine Flotilla's campaign represents one of the most disproportionate force-to-effect ratios in modern naval warfare. The tiny boats that critics dismissed as inadequate proved perfectly adapted to the one theatre that mattered most. The submarines that were never meant to fight won the supply war that decided North Africa, and Rommel's Afrika Corps starved because of them.